Great. It seems like we could go on about land tax, but there's a couple of more ideas that I wanted to discuss, and perhaps we can discuss two of them basically at the same time. The one of them is the National Development Bank, and perhaps we can already tie the idea of having a National Development Bank with an idea of an export-led growth and economy. Now, the National Development Banks. That's an idea that, again, it's fairly old. It's something that's used a lot in other countries, but currently at Latvia and basically the in the eurozone generally, banking has largely been privatized, and the prerogative to issue currency has been basically delegated to private institutions. And as I said, sort of the eurozone is kind of sort of quintessential example of that, where sort of banking, finance, and money is basically in private hands, and it's almost impossible for us to imagine that these basically banking and money could be subject to public sector controls and directives. But again, in places like China that have experienced very rapid development and industrialization, this has been precisely the case. And I think if we look at the kind of economic environment where we live, it's likely that central banking will probably remain sort of independent in the near future, and will again mainly sort of cater to private interests. But a way forward could be the setup of national development banks. That is something that I think is fairly feasible within the existing political economic climate. So what are they? What are exactly national development banks? Why is such a public bank better for a country's development than sort of the existing structure of having private commercial banks? What are the benefits of having a development bank as opposed to the current system that we have? I'm not sure if anyone wants to just jump right in and start explaining it again from the kind of basic level of the idea. Kasper is Jeff.
I think Kaspar should go first on this. He's been thinking a lot about this in the context of Latvia. I think we should lead off with him.
All right. Well, without too much recourse into history, again, we covered that in the previous seminar. There are great examples from KfW in Germany, which is now also in COVID times playing a very, very important role also as a provider of liquidity to companies. Also, Bendes is a great example in Brazil, Korea Development Bank, all of these excellent examples which served and still serve not only as, in a kind of neoliberal theory, there is also a role for a development institution, but that is usually minimized to the role of simply fixing market failures, the so-called market failures. Whereas, of course, the historic successful examples and some of the more progressive economic theory of today, including that by Marianna Mazzucato and her team, shows that there is a room for a mission-oriented, active development bank. And in Latvia, we have precisely that context. I mean, back in the day, we used to have a land development bank. Now we have Altum, which is not a full-fledged bank. It doesn't have a banking license, although, of course, it has a capacity of providing loans and guarantees, and maybe kind of promotes financial inclusion where maybe the traditional banking sector falls short. But overall, there are a number of basic functions that a full-fledged national development bank could promote. I mean, including things related to counter-cyclical finance. We know that whenever times are bad, commercial banks become risk-averse. They are already quite risk-averse when there's a recession, and as we saw also during the 2007-2010 crisis, they're extremely risk-averse. So that dries up liquidity in the market. And the other one is, of course, investment banks or national development banks that promote innovation and structural transformation. Again, we see how KfW in Germany has championed this green transformation of the German economy, of the German energy system. They were among the first ones to invest in solar energy, and we now, of course, see as Germany is diversifying its energy mix, away from coal, away from oil, into renewables. And KfW as the development bank is right in the forefront of that development. Infrastructure development is obviously a great example. I mean, in Scandinavia, much of the infrastructure is financed through national development institutions. And then this leads us to the context for Latvia. I mean, I would say that there again, I subscribe to the approach that if it's worthwhile having a national development bank, then it is such a bank that has some mission to pursue. And there is a wide range of missions that the Latvian economy could pursue. And some of them are, for example, well, some economists don't believe in picking winners. I don't think that it has to go down to belief. I think it has to go down to empirical evidence. We see that some of the most successful historically industrial policies and their execution has been based on actually picking winners or national champions. And I'm not saying that we should have a list of 100 companies which now receive all kind of state support, but picking out specialized activities which have comparative advantage, that are long-term scalable, that add to the complexity of the economy, that have a so-called increasing returns potential, that are technologically intense, and of course that can be export-oriented. And there are quite a few industries like that in Latvia. And the other major mission is anything to do with digitalization. Industry 4.0, digitalization of public services. Clearly, the fourth industrial revolution is all about digitalization, including digitalization of infrastructure. Green transformation, that was already mentioned, but clearly also in Latvia, there's a major potential from things like, again, diversifying the energy mix with the elements of import substitution away from fossil fuels, all the way to energy efficiency, which is a long delayed mission that would add a lot of value to the Latvian economy. Then there is the age-old mission of agricultural and forestry cooperation. I mean, we live next door to the world's most competitive agricultural and forestry cooperatives in the Nordics. There's nothing that prevents us from emulating those. And then three final missions for consideration. One is kind of the broader subject of reindustrialization and generally setting up an industrial base, which then serves also as basis for an export-driven development. Then I already touched infrastructure, but it is important that there's a national development bank that promotes infrastructure development in what we call a dig once philosophy. In other words, when you build a railway, you make sure you co-synchronize also development of other types of infrastructure, road infrastructure, 5G and fiber infrastructure, energy, water, and all of these other things at the same time. So you derive a lot of benefit from one investment. And then final point, again, as a mission, is the provision of public housing. I'm very happy to hear that in some of the recovery and resilience package measures, public housing has been mentioned as a potential policy that could be a potential mission of a national development bank. So I think I threw a lot of chips on the table, and we'll be happy to hear what others think about these.
Great. I'm very happy for you, Yanni or Jeff, to react to what Kasper said. There's I guess just two aspects that I think are also worth addressing in one way or another. One is the question of where would, if we did create a national development bank here in Latvia, or transform Altum into a proper bank, what would be the kind of funding requirements, or where would the bank get the capital from within the what are the kind of rules, the existing rules within the Eurozone, within the European Union that permit funding? What's the kind of requirement side? It might be a technical question, but I guess it's also important to address. Would that bank be able to create capital on its own, or would it still have to go look for it somewhere else? And the second part, which I also think is sometimes people worry about the fact that if we did create a public institution like that, there was always the kind of threat of corruption that again the insiders would get their own projects funded, and how would we actually deal with this issue? I'm not sure, Jeff or Janis, if again, I'm happy for you to react to what Kasper said, but just these additional 2 points.
Yeah, I have a slightly different angle on this, so I think Janis should go before me, because it's probably going to be dealing more in sync with Kaspar's remarks. So Janis, if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Jeff. I think that the question, first of all, of the corruption is a very important question, and we don't want corruption. We also don't want an institution here that creates credit, that creates like a local bubbles here in real estate, or that displaces local banks, commercial banks that want to do their business, and suddenly somebody comes in with a super cheap loans, with state guarantees, and then just displaces them. So those things are bad. So that's something that we don't want. So how to resolve this? I think very clearly it is resolvable if we would tell that development bank that what we want to do is we want to develop export-led economy. If that development bank would support exporting companies only, then in that case, first of all, the corruption risk is minimized. Whenever you are dealing in export, then you don't want to have a bad reputation, and also you are forced to essentially produce a product that is required, that is needed somewhere else outside of Latvia, and you can't corrupt other people to buy it for the most part, and so it is that export kind of angle serves as a clear differentiator that first of all allows to differentiate and select the companies that are producing something useful, that are not corrupt companies, and that are not distorting the local market in any way. What we need in Latvia is we need to bring more money from abroad inside here as revenue from the exports that makes the whole country richer. So again, if we would support those companies, that kind of corruption, that market distortion, all of these things are really going away. So I feel very strongly that we need to build an export-led economy, and I understand that we are going to talk about it in the last segment, so I'm stopping here. But I think that if we would tell the development bank to concentrate on that, that would be simply fabulous. The other things, of course, obviously, that the export bank can concentrate on that as local, maybe would be to tackle some infrastructure challenges that the commercial banks are not interested or willing, that are maybe too far fetched or too risky things to do. I think right now we have Altums. In my opinion, Altums is working very well as an institution. It's not a bank. It would benefit from being a bank, but as it is developing and working quite well. I'm not so sure, kind of from policy point of view, how easy it would be to transform Altums into a bank, and if the commercial banks would not be too jealous about that, I don't know. But we definitely need to strengthen Altums as a way how to attract funding. And it is clear that today the exporting companies in Latvia are way too small. We need at least triple their size. And they are unable to develop because their capital is too small overall. They have too low capital base. The commercial banks are unable to lend them because they are too weak, our exporters. And if we want to get from here to there to like a significantly larger exporting sector, we need to have a state support system, a state support financial system, because without that, without money that is available for development, we will simply continue this very slow growth. Is growth, yes, I'm not saying it's not growth. There are some very good examples, but very, very slow. We're growing very, very slowly. If we really want to get rich, if we want to grow at something like 7% per year, which would be a nice and sustainable way how to grow, we need far more capital into the economy, and without a government intervention in the export sector, that capital is not forthcoming. It's an illusion to think it will not come. So we need to do something about it. So strengthening Altums, perhaps converting into a national development bank, perhaps setting up a national development bank, these things need to be really discussed out, but it's a very important subject. Jeff, over to you.
Yeah, I certainly agree with the suggestions tendered by both Kaspars and Jānis in the score. And, just to remind people that these are historically proven, tried and successful means by which development has been fostered. By extending credit at lower prices to key sectors of the economy, you can advance their development and thereby making the rest of the economy grow faster as well. I would also add that development tends to, over time, actually reduce corruption as well. So we should remember that. So slow growing economies and economies in which many rents essentially are being extracted from it tends to increase corruption. So this is a means by which over the long term you can actually reduce corruption, although of course you need very good oversight to make sure that some of the abuses that Andris and Janis have both alluded to do not happen in any great measure. And I think some of Janis's suggestions in terms of where you target the money are certainly good ones. Regarding what you said, Andris, if we take a look at Article 123 of the Lisbon Treaty, it's actually kind of vague, which is good. I mean, it says that you can't buy bonds directly from the central bank, but you can do other things to create credit. I mean, you can just create credit on your National Development Bank's balance sheet, extend it out as loans, and then the money comes back in terms of debt service payments. I mean, so, and there are various quantitative easing strategies as well, which can be produced. So there's end runs around some of the restrictions that are put in place, unfortunately, by Article 123, which I think has served the European Union very badly. So there's just a lot of, let's just say, bending of the rules that have occurred with Article 123, and I'm highly encouraging of that process. Because again, it has been something that has been bad for development. So by all means, look at who has successfully bent those rules, follow their lead. I said I wanted to go in a different direction, and I'll explain what I meant by that earlier. I think that we should give more consideration to nonprofit institutions, not necessarily public, but nonprofit institutions at the consumer level of banking as well. Kaspars mentioned the role of producer cooperatives in the Nordic countries, and they are very impressive in terms of what they've achieved. And in fact, many of those same kinds of institutions were exported by the Nordics to the United States in the 19th century in areas that were resource rich in terms of forestry, etc., and agriculture, produced very, very good results. But it seems as though the Latvian consumer is overburdened with fees from its banking system. And both, whether we look at Germany or even the United States, where we have very robust levels of credit unions in place and development of credit unions, I think it might behoove Latvia to consider developing more of these kinds of institutions where you have postal banks, as Japan does. Put credit unions in your post offices, in your libraries, and give people access to the money so they're not charged so much money for just accessing it as they are through many of your private banks. And this would be another way of getting money in people's pockets, and then they would be spending that in the larger economy and generating economic activity. So I think that's something to give consideration to as well.
I fully agree with Jeff, and you can see that, for instance, in Lithuania, they developed a very kind of a krājēsdeva sabiedrība credit union friendly legislation, and they have created via that a very large movement of these krājēsdeva sabiedrība credit unions. And now in the Lithuanian countryside, in small villages, in towns, there are a lot of places where you can actually very successfully get the banking services from these credit unions, and you get a lot of credit also from them. And that serves very well the very small micro companies that need to develop right now. So we have right now a huge debate, for instance, in Latvia, what should be the taxation level on the very small companies. And many of the small owners of the small companies say, well, we need this lower taxation because we don't have enough income. And why don't you have enough income? Well, because they don't have any funds to develop. They can't grow bigger so that they would have more productivity and so that they would kind of earn more money and then they can afford more tax. That road is closed. So there's no credit available to them. So they are stuck in a very unproductive small areas, and then obviously they can't pay more tax. And then we are burdened with these guys that are unable then later to receive pensions, to receive social support in case they are ill or something. So it's a kind of a dead-end situation, and we really need to resolve it. Lithuania has been very successful resolving that, And in Latvia, sadly, the legislation that is upheld by the Ministry of Finance and also Latvia's Banka and FKTK, it's completely anti these small cooperative banks. And as a result, Latvian Krājasdevas sabiedrības is 10 times smaller than in Lithuania. And as a result, in Lithuania, there's no huge amount of credit that has been flowing to the small communities, to small businesses, to people that want to develop something small locally, out of which they can maybe grow something bigger. And this is big part of the success story of Lithuania. So we need big development bank to fund bigger things. We need capital fund to fund with capital larger enterprises that want to go big and do something. But we also need on the small level, on the micro level, on a level of small companies, we need a way how to sustainably finance that. And Krājasdevas sabiedrības, these credit unions, definitely is the best way how to do that. It is unimaginable that a big central bank like Swedbank would fund, I don't know, 2,000 euro loan somewhere in Varakļāni. I mean, it costs more for them to understand that the gentleman or lady from Varakļāni that wants to take out this loan, is he real, is he fake, will he return, will he not? I mean, the cost of doing that for somebody from the very beautiful skyscraper office is prohibitively high. So they will never do that. So you never get this credit. It's not flowing. And then, well, what to do? This lady or gentleman from Varakļāni or Līvāni or somewhere, he'll be just forced to move to Riga. It's bad, it's not good. He has a house there, he has infrastructure there, he has school there. Why do that? So we need to do that for development, more like equal development within country. We really also need to do that. And Lithuania has beautiful system. I fully don't understand why the Ministry of Finance is lazy to take a look at what is done in Lithuania and to copy that, and is hiding behind like empty words that it's kind of risky or that it's unimaginable or that nobody needs it, or other kinds of bureaucratic and empty words that I've heard from them, which is completely ridiculous and completely against them.
Andris, if I may return to one of your two questions with regard to the capitalization of Altum, in full agreement with what both Jānis and Jeff are saying about kind of the micro liquidity, which is critical. One is, of course, that today, of course, Altum, whatever they borrow, they can lend, and then they distribute some of the grant funding, but they can't multiply money for sure because they don't have a banking license. So a banking license would go a long way, within the capital adequacy framework of being able to also create money. Ideally, not at loggerheads with the commercial banking sector, but I think there's room for both a national public development bank and the commercial banking sector. But the other, of course, critical cash stream, so to speak, is of course the EU structural funds. And today, unfortunately, they're often distributed on kind of a feudal principles. Yes, you have the finance ministry who's kind of orchestrating the parade, but still it's up to the ministries, up to the civil servants to determine oftentimes, what are the priorities. So that never works in a concerted effort promoting some longer term missions, which is something I think we emphasized during the previous talk. And because of that, this idea of a national development bank for me also goes hand in hand with a proper national industrial and innovation policy, one that promotes the transformation of the Latvian economic structure to, the one that's more modern, sustainable, also diversified and more complex, more socially responsible, and ultimately also digitally ready. And all of these factors would then, of course, serve as competition and competitiveness factors also in export competitiveness.
It seems to make sense to me to actually perhaps move the next couple of segments around and actually address then the issue of how to create an economy that is export led and how does that sort of fit within the wider industrial policy. There's again, the way we spoke about it last time as well. I mean, we've spoken about export for the past 30 years. There's been, at least rhetorically, a certain kind of support for the idea. At the same time, we haven't really become an export country. And again, based on what's been happening since the pandemic, what are the ways in which we should think about these issues? What are exactly the kinds of goods or services that we should be exporting, and then where, and then again, in what way would the National Development Bank come into this picture? Andris, perhaps I'll let you start on this.
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the choices when you are thinking about development of economy is what do you want to develop? Do you want to develop a domestic sector, or do you want to develop an export sector? So I think it is for me, it's very clear that for a very small country like what Latvia is, it's a very small country, the market is very small, and it is impossible to create a company that would have products that are competitive in the pricing if the company is only devoted to the Latvian market. It's too small. So each batch of production is too small, so the self-cost of the product is too high, and it's not competitive. So the only companies that can produce something that is competitive are export-oriented companies, because there the market, compared to very small Latvia, the world is very big. So you can produce in large batches, you can produce something big, so your self-cost goes down and you become competitive and profitable. So from that perspective, export is the only way how you can develop something like a competitive company. The other thing is the question, where is the money coming from? I mean, the obvious answer is from the bank, from the ATM machines. So you stick in your credit card and out comes the money. But where does money come there? Where does money come into the economy in the first place? Maybe is the next question. And I think it's coming in from the export. So you sell something abroad, euro comes in, and then that enlarges the local currency supply. And then everybody has more euros. So it is what we are richer. So it's essentially we've had more money coming in via the export. So from that perspective, we know from the history of many countries that have been growing fast, they have been doing that via export-led economies. There is really no other way around it. So if we want to be a rich country, and if we want to grow at something like fast growth rates, at least 7% per year, the only way how to do that is if we are building up export-led companies. The question is which companies to support. And maybe the first question is, do we need to support some sector, like specific sector that we say, okay, we go for this sector and then we support nothing else? I think maybe not. In Latvia, I think the one of the beauties of Latvian economy is that we have companies in many export segments, and that really makes us diversified, and that is good. Also, another beauty is that we are very close to Scandinavia, and we can very easily link to Scandinavian, Northern European supply chains, and we don't necessarily have to produce something from here, from local ingredients. So again, from that sense of point of view, it can be whatever. But I think a very good kind of way how to distinguish companies that need to be supported versus the ones that don't need to be supported is the value added. How much value added a company produces from one employee. And there are big differences in Latvian economy. So some of the companies that produce the lowest value added in Latvian economy sadly are the ones in the restaurant and food and catering business. They have very low value added overall. Tourism, by the way, is also with very low added value in Latvia. So what we are selling, the hotel beds, is very low value, and the people are receiving also very low value. And some of the companies that are producing very large, very high value added per employee are companies in pharmaceutical area, in electronics, in software development. So I think it's a kind of a good way to look, is to look at, where the companies with larger value added are, and then go for the companies and try to develop those companies that are able to produce higher value added per employee. So that I think would be kind of a good way how to look and think. So it's a company that can export, that has a very large possible market, and that has a very high value added per employee. So those would be kind of my criteria if I were to choose, with which company to go, what to support in this export-led economy.
The one reservation that I have is if I if I look at the large exporting countries currently in the world, and that would be Germany and China, they're also hugely unequal countries, and that's in many ways a deliberate policy choice, right? Is repressing wages, is repressing local consumption, make sure that the trade surplus or the current account surplus remains in surplus, and that basically creates a certain kind of class interest, which becomes very powerful. And then the question is, how do we make sure that say we do design Latvia as an export country and it's a success? How do we make sure that the gains are actually fairly and evenly distributed throughout society? Because knowing Latvia, say we do have increased tax revenue receipts, how do we make sure that these aren't used to pay down the national debt, which is has been growing now during the last year? How do we make sure that there isn't a specific sort of exporter class arising, which is very powerful in lobbying for certain kind of tax cuts for themselves at the expense of others, and these kinds of issues. Jeff or Kaspar, to be honest, perhaps I'm not sure if anybody who would like to react to these kind of concerns that these kinds of this kind of policy might engender.
Yeah, I think we should feel that at the end. Kaspars, do you have anything more to say about development and export policy? Because I know this is something you've thought a lot about. I think you should tender your comments first.
Continuing some of the thoughts that Jānis has developed, looking back on some of the policies that Latvia has developed, a few years back there was something that was called the smart specialization strategy or something like that. And basically, it correctly, in my view, emphasized that there should be kind of three-pronged approach. One, you need to not forget also about the traditional industries, because sometimes there is an obsession about the very hip startups and how they will be creating these unicorns, and this will be the new supercharged Latvian economy of the 21st century. That usually doesn't work unless you have an industrial and innovation base, which leads to systematic development of such unicorns, which means that they're not unicorns anymore because they are part of a systematic process. So there was a focus on kind of strengthening the manufacturing and export capacity of the traditional industries. Because of course, some of the giants of the Latvian economy, including the woodworking industry, which still exports annually goods worth of 2 billion, most of which, at least half of which, is sawn timber, which is again a bit tragic 30 years after the regaining of the independence. Then of course you also have the food processing industry with a relatively limited added value, and also you see kind of elements of locking in a bit of colonial relationships with us, as the Latvian economy exporting production inputs and then paying for final goods from some of our neighboring countries, which is a bad industrial policy. So traditional industries was one area. The other area, which is something that Jānis also emphasized, is finding those growth activities, not necessarily on a sectoral basis, because a whole sector is like the average body temperature in a hospital. I mean, it's so diverse, and as Jānis notes, I fully agree. We have a pretty diversified set of small and medium-sized companies, but maybe not a whole one coherent industry where everything needs to be supported. So finding those and developing the added value potential, that was kind of seen as the second important prong. And then the third one was kind of industries with an important horizontal impact on the economy and also on the transformation of the economy. But interestingly, even though on the high level, they kind of correctly categorized the Latvian economy, the recommendations of that strategy was to kind of focus on particular niche industries, such as, I think it was bioeconomics, there was biomedicine and pharmaceuticals, there was of course IT, there was smart energy, some smaller elements taken out from the wider economic structure. And if you add them together, they wouldn't carry too much macroeconomic weight. So yes, all of those industries are worthwhile promoting, also by public means, but they're not the ones that will kind of serve as the main wind in the sail of the entire economy. And then complementing that smart specialization strategy was the industrial policy or kind of guidelines for industrial policy development. I think it was 2014, 2020. So it just is ending this year, and none of the KPIs are achieved, including 15% manufacturing incidents in the economy. That's definitely not achieved. But also because it was a very hands-off industrial policy, because it was based on theories of industrial policy that is there to alleviate market failure. These were not activist kind of mission-oriented tools that Andris is talking about, with a very direct, for example, mission to promote the export competency sector, export complexity, with a growing added value, and promoting all of these other side impacts. So if we think about an export-driven development, we need to maybe again return to an inventory of the Latvian economy. What are the strengths? Again, a balance between the existing traditional competitive advantages, but also fields of future growth. I mean, the IT industry is a great example from the services export perspective. I mean, back in the day, it used to be, of course, transport and finance. Transport is still 40% of Latvian services export, and of course, finance is diminishing rapidly. But the growing superstar is the IT industry, for example. So clearly, one industry, not everyone in that industry, but especially those that have export capacity and growing added value and complexity, those, of course, need to be supported. So I think, an understanding of what are those potential long-term advantages, and such that do not lock us in, as some have. For example, sawn timber exports or transit of coal and oil products coming from the east or the eastern financial offshore. These are not sustainable elephants on which to hold a long-term Latvian economic development. So I'm in sync definitely with Andris on the need to find these kind of scalable, competent, complex, and long-term growth potential niches and companies and industries.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I'm not going to add much at all. I mean, you're very fortunate tonight in that you have two of Latvia's very top experts on this particular topic, and it's always a pleasure and a delight to hear what they have to say, because the advice that they tender is just very, very smart, and I hope it'll be installed as national policy. But of course, the one thing that Kaspars could talk about for the entire hour himself, if given the opportunity, and I think he should be given that opportunity in the future, is to talk about the role of infrastructure in promoting industrial development as well. So, after you target your chief sectors for development, what would be the infrastructure needs that would facilitate or foster their development? So that's something that we don't have time to address now, but Kaspars is certainly your guy to go to for that. And of course, I'm sure Andris would have many useful comments to contribute on that as well. Regarding, though, something you said, Andris, which of course is the problem of emerging inequality in the global system. I guess something that Thomas Piketty and others have alluded to. These are vexing problems. Of course, much of it just comes with the supply side revolution of the past 40 years, which has suggested that if we just put more capital in private hands, that is automatically going to lead to development. And so we cut taxes and we push down wages to that end, in the hopes that the capital that is liberated becomes investment capital, which in turn is put into research and development, which in turn leads to innovation, which in turn leads to higher levels of productivity. Well, of course, we've seen over the past 40 years that has not happened. And referencing, people such as Mariana Mazzucato, who, of course, Kaspars and Andris are quite familiar with her work, as she has shown, much of the essential R&D that is needed in order for companies to commercialize it, develop it, get it out to the market. The basic research can really only be funded by the public sector. So there needs to be more complementarity there. But in terms of that inequality issue, I mean, we just have to dispense with a lot of the supply side nonsense that somehow if you just make wealthy people even richer, that it's going to automatically lead to development. Now they can use their capital effectively, but you have to incentivize it with the proper tax policies and just to make sure that it doesn't get dumped into real estate or valuable tracts of land in the city center which sit idle for 30 years and then maybe get sold at a windfall profit after a few decades. I mean, that's the kind of thing that you absolutely want to avoid.
I feel that for instance the question on inequality would be and the question of like low wages as a way how to drive these companies up is it's a question. I look at it this way. Look, first of all, you need the export economy, and an export economy that's with certain amount of inequality, but that brings in capital to the country is better than no export at all. Because if you don't have any export but very equal society, then it's equally poor. There's no point in that. So better to have unequal but export oriented than nothing. But the export oriented with very low wages is also a kind of a dead end or something that you can do for a few years and then it's over. Because sooner or later, they move these exporting companies that exploit low wages, they just move down somewhere into a different country. So you need to have a way how you are developing exporting industry that pays high wages. So how do you do that? The answer is the value added per employee. So if the value added per employee in a company is high, it can easily afford to pay high wages and still be competitive. How do you get that it is able to have a high value added per employee? Well, it has to be in the right business and the right sector. Secondly, it has to have some intellectual property, because that isn't kind of an easy way how to do that. And it has to have large enough scale of manufacturing. When it has a large enough scale of manufacturing and has intellectual property, then you can do that. Now, how to get there? I think you need to support export-led companies, and also you need to support R&D and investment into R&D. Because if you are developing and supporting R&D, then you are allowing the companies to produce goods that can be sold at a higher price or with a higher margins. Whenever you have higher margins, then you can easily afford to pay higher wages. And then you are not stuck into a competitive necessity to have a low wage economy. And I think that actually, and the other thing, the third thing that is very necessary there is a credit that's available for investment. If you have great idea, but you don't have money for it, I mean, that idea remains an idea. So if we want to develop an export-led economy that pays high wages and is sustainable, we need government expenditure on R&D. There's no way around it, and heavy subsidies for the companies towards the R&D. Right now, they're not there in Latvia. And second is you need enough capital for the companies to develop. So the development bank, more money for the Altum, other kind of options that are there and that can develop us, and a clear kind of push towards sectors where there is higher added value. And if we are, for instance, developing software companies, these have zero problem to pay 2,000, 3,000 euro salaries and tax and still be profitable because simply their goods can be sold at that price. If we want to develop, let's say, companies in textile industry where there would be people, with the sewing machines producing jeans, there is zero way that these can have a high wages. They are competing then with the Chinese and the Vietnamese, etc. So there's zero way that you can pay them anything normal. So if you want to develop that kind of a companies, then you need to really depress wages, make a very huge inequality in society. That's the only way how you can drive an export economy like that. That's something that we don't want. So I think that also a very clear understanding that if we want to drive wages up, then we need more resources for R&D. If we need more resources for R&D, we need, sadly, to have a little bit more tax that we can put back into a form of R&D is also something that we really need to think about here overall as a country. And so I think that there are countries like China that show that you can grow pretty quickly, and also their incomes, their wages also are growing in China, and the country overall is developing. And why? And many people have been saying, for instance, in regards to credit, that in China there's a credit bubble, the bubble will burst, it will be over. I've heard this like many times over the years, but you can see that the Chinese bubble never ends, and it continues. And I think mathematically, kind of a very elegant way how to say why the Chinese bubble continues forever is because their cost of funding is lower than the rate of growth. So as long as China is able to grow at something like 7% per year, but the cost of funding is below 7% per year, so let's say 2-3%, then the bubble is like forever sustainable, because there will be more profits generated out of this bubble than the cost of the banking fees and interest paid, so you can continue forever. If we are on the other side in an economy where companies pay, let's say 8% for the loans, but grow at a speed of maybe 2-3% per year or 4% per year, then obviously mathematically you end up with a higher debt burden that stops you sooner or later. So that is again, kind of a thing why we need to think about government-funded or government-subsidized funding opportunities for companies, because we need to provide the credit at reasonable rates simply to be able to sustain this kind of forever bubble, if you want to call it that way, like what the China has done. And that creates lots more of opportunities for growth and prosperity for everybody. Plus R&D, we must invest more in R&D and development of the products.
Now, this kind of what you mentioned, research and development, and kind of moving perhaps closer to the issue of social policy, the long-term solutions for inequality are kind of broadly accepted. There are investments in healthcare, investments in education. Is there and lately I'm thinking, is there a kind of way in which, because we're talking about a lot of investment needed in many different areas, and it's clear that there has to be some kind of reckoning of what the kind of how to do that properly to make sure that all the investment is carried out financially feasibly. Is there a way in which the kind of necessary investments in healthcare and education can be sort of tied together with these investments in developing the kind of export segment of the economy, in the sense that a growing export economy would automatically mean growing investments in healthcare and education? Is there a kind of way in which we can square these different kind of investment projects to make sure that all of them develop organically in reaction to each?
I would maybe do first. I think one of the kind of a really neoliberal approaches to development has been saying very cleverly that you need to invest more in education. And if people will be more educated, more smarter, then the economy will grow. But sadly, it hasn't worked out for Latvia. So we have invested a lot in education. We have a very high number of people with higher education, but they are all emigrated to Ireland and UK. So essentially what we've done is we've created a very highly educated workforce that we've paid. I mean, I'm a parent. I know exactly how much it costs to raise a child. Like purely monetary, it's huge. Every parent knows that. And then if a child like that's only my money, but then imagine the government's money additionally in schools, everything else. If you put it together, it's a huge amount. And if a child like that at the age of 25 leaves and works somewhere in Germany or UK, all that investment is lost essentially for the country. It's not coming back. So I think that kind of one way how not to develop a country is simply to orient yourself to develop highly skilled people, then they are leaving. So jobs is very, very important. So if you don't have good jobs that pay good, so that people that are finishing universities here have good jobs here that are paying good wages, so that they are able to stay and grow here in Latvia, it also doesn't square anything, So from that perspective, everything comes together. So you can't have great healthcare system, you can't have great education system if you don't have great jobs. And the only way how to create great jobs is to grow your export sector. So you have to do all three things simultaneously. And just making education great is making Germany great and Ireland great, not Latvia.
And this maybe also leads to a bit of a paradox. I mean, Latvia is a middle income country with relatively low purchasing power and low wages. At the same time, when you think in terms of kind of competitiveness and cost of production, it's a high cost economy because I mean the financial costs are relatively high, because of an underdeveloped financial industry. Therefore, high margins. I think Jeff alluded to that in detail. The labor costs are high, even though take home pay is low, but the overall labor costs are high because 70% goes on top of the net pay, and per unit, Latvia probably has one of the world's largest labor tax rates. Healthcare is also relatively expensive. Supposedly it's free, but still there is a huge percentage of out of pocket. So for employees and for the wider public, these costs are high. Innovation costs are high because there's no systemic way of subsidizing the innovation process. In conjunction with some of the universities and research facilities, like Sweden does. I mean, there's a triangle between public, academia and the corporate sector to co-develop infrastructure. Then also, you have somewhat of a poor infrastructure, which also leads to higher production cost. And ultimately, since Latvia is 50% of Latvian economy is Riga, and Riga is arguably the only agglomeration in Latvia that has kind of economies of scale of being, an economy of regional or international significance. And because of that, and because of poor tax policies, the real estate costs are high. So that's an additional cost for developing business in Latvia and developing a base for export competitiveness out of Latvia. And this is a bit of a paradox because on one hand we are a middle income country. We supposedly should be competitive in terms of our cost structure, but unfortunately we are not, because all of the other costs in the economy are relatively high, or higher than would be normal for our level of development.
I think that Kaspar's made a really, really important point. And when looking at, for instance, and I've been asking banks as part of the government's effort to develop a strategy, I've been asking banks, so why is the total lending dropping in Latvia? Why still today, lending levels go down every year? Since 2010, every year, lower lending levels. So you get less and less money in the economy. So how can you grow with lower lending levels? It's impossible. And you ask the banks why, but they say we have nobody to finance. What do you mean? Nobody to finance? Yeah, but the companies, they don't have enough profitability. Their EBITDA levels are too low. And why is that? We are supposedly we should be more competitive than the Sweden with lower wages, so the company should be making lots of profit, but it's not the case, because other costs are too high. And if you look, for instance, my company, we specialized in building floors for industrial buildings. I can sadly tell you, in Sweden we are building incomparably more. So right now we are, for instance, participating in a huge 300,000 square meter project building a battery plant for electric vehicles in Sweden. Why in Sweden? Why are they building it in Sweden? Why not in Latvia? Because the electricity cost, for instance, is too high in Latvia. It's so high that it doesn't, you can't build electricity intensive manufacturing like producing batteries for electric vehicles. So you want to develop green economy and everything, but because of the tax on electricity, the OEK, our costs are out of hand, and other costs like the tax on the wages, etc., is out of hand, and so we are not getting this manufacturing unit here. And what is the result? The result is that probably some Latvians are going to be ending up working there in that plant, like so many people are working in Sweden. And what is good in there for Latvia? Nothing. So I think that we really need to think seriously as a company, how do we lower cost while at the same time increasing the wages for people? And what are the ways how we can really think? I think it's clear that the existing way, the way how we have been working past 30 years is not really sustainable, doesn't work out. There's nothing come out of it, and we need to change a few things. And I think some of the things that we alluded to here in this discussion are totally things that are necessary to do, because otherwise that's a dead end.
I mean, I think we've come full circle here in a very good way, in that this is really the crux of the matter. Latvia does have a high cost economy, and all of the things that we have discussed previously, whether it be a land value tax in order to replace, to switch out with the high labor taxes, and also in order to reduce the cost of housing, and many of these other costs that we've talked about, whether it be for access to your capital, etc. All of these things make Latvia a high-cost country. A country that has many sources of passive income is going to be a high-cost country. And so that is a cost which comes in the form, ultimately, of lower wages, lower levels of development, and it's just more expensive for people to live. So if one is wondering, well, what's in it for me in terms of all of these changes that we've proposed, it's just that. Ultimately, what we're talking about is reducing costs in Latvia, making a more efficient, productive, innovative economy that is less burdened with these myriad of costs, that can allow people to live better, healthier, with more income, and with more capital available for investment in the social sphere and other spheres as well.
This is rounding up very, very, very beautifully. But I think before we by way of conclusion, the issue of jobs was already mentioned, and the last idea that I wanted to sort of bounce up with you was the idea of a job guarantee program, which has become a kind of almost a personal favorite of mine to think about.